Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Marc Bushala. This is episode number 695 for May 6th, 2018. Coming up in a few minutes.
He's not in the basement mixing up the medicine. He's given us more creative direction and ultimately telling us when we've gotten to something that he really loves. So it was a very interesting process because his feedback is not what you get in terms of technical feedback from somebody who's a whiskey, blender or distiller.
You know Bob Dylan as a legendary singer and songwriter and the winner of last year's Nobel Prize for Literature. But you probably didn't know that he is also a painter and a metal worker, and now he's in the whiskey business. In fact, the metal gates he designed and crafted now appear on the bottles for the 3 new Heaven's Door whiskies. Marc Bushala is one of Bob Dylan's partners in Heaven's Door. He was part of the team that built Angel's Envy Bourbon from the ground up. He and his chief whiskey maker, Ryan Perry, will join us on WhiskyCast In-Depth, and I'll have my tasting notes for Heaven's Door, too. That's coming up later on, along with the calendar of events, your voice, and we'll also go behind the label just ahead on WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
This is whiskey, Johnnie Walker's Scotch whisky, from this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnnie Walker Black Label. Step right up.
Let's start off with the news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. We'll begin with Brexit, where, for the first time, we are getting some idea of what the impact of Great Britain's divorce from the European Union could have on the Scotch whisky industry. Scotch Whisky Association Chief Executive Karen Betts estimated this week at the association's annual meeting that unless the British government can find a way to keep the current EU trade agreements in place after Brexit, Scotch whisky producers could be looking at £53 million each year in new trade tariffs. That may not seem like a lot, since last year's exports of Scotch whisky added up to almost £4.4 billion, but as the SWA's Graham Littlejohn explains, those tariffs would come from just 24 countries.
South Korea, I already mentioned, that was over £70 million of Scotch whisky exports last year in 2017. South Africa, £114 million last year. Switzerland, Colombia, big kind of global markets for Scotch, and each have different tariffs or have had different tariffs over the years. South Korea was a 20% tariff, as I mentioned. Morocco, another one of those countries, 49% tariff, again brought down to zero through an EU deal. What would happen if we don't have continuity of those free trade agreements is the tariff would go back up to that level, and an additional tariff burden would fall on the industry. And across the world, that would be £53 million. And these are big markets because it takes up about 10% of all Scotch whisky exports, these markets. £449 million of Scotch whisky was exported to these 24 markets last year. So it's really important that we have continuity of these free trade agreements and the tariffs remain at zero or as close to zero as possible.
And we're not even talking about India, China, Brazil, the big countries, right?
Well, that's another level of detail there. I mean, a lot of these countries, India, Japan, the Mercosur countries, they're at various stages of EU trade deal negotiation right now, and they haven't come into force yet. But you're right to say that the £53 million that I'm talking about are from the 24 deals that are agreed and are enforced. Then, if you look at the other countries where tariffs might be brought down under deals which may enter force when the UK leaves, that's another level of kind of concern for the industry, where we want to have access to these agreements that haven't entered force yet, and it's something else we'll be talking to very closely with the UK government about.
Part of the problem stems from the fact that the UK can't technically start negotiating trade deals with other countries until it actually leaves the European Union next March. But there is a tentative transition plan that would keep the current agreements in place until the end of 2020. However, Bloomberg News reports that there has been discussion within Prime Minister Theresa May's government about extending the transition period out as far as 2023 to provide enough time to set up a new border control and customs system. Last time around, we reported on the beginning of Scotland's new minimum pricing scheme for alcoholic beverages. The plan sets a minimum price of £14 for a standard 70 cl bottle of Scotch whisky and was designed to fight alcohol abuse. Scotland is now the first nation to set a floor price for alcoholic beverages, and other nations are looking at similar ideas. The Scotch Whisky Association fought for almost 6 years to block that plan in the courts, but now that it's in effect, Graham Littlejohn says the association wants to make sure that it works as intended.
We've been working very constructively with the Scottish Government and others since the Supreme Court ruling in November last year to ensure a smooth implementation of minimum unit pricing in Scotland. It's too soon to tell on the impact it will have either on the Scotch whisky industry or on public health. But what we'll be working with the Scottish Government and others on in the next few years is a robust, independent assessment of minimum unit pricing, so we can actually gather that data and find out what the policy is doing, both to the health of the nation and to the Scotch whisky industry.
There's a 5-year sunset clause in the minimum pricing law, which would allow for a review of the law's effectiveness before it's extended. In other news, we've reported on the shortage of Japanese whiskeys for several years now, and while the country's distilleries have ramped up production, stocks of aged whiskeys are becoming even harder to find. The Nikkei Asian Review reports this weekend that online retail prices for Suntory's Yamazaki 12-year-old have broken the 20,000 yen mark. That's around $183 a bottle at current exchange rates and is up 70% over the last 2 years. Here's another example. The duty-free shop at Japan's Haneda Airport is able to get its hands on only 12 bottles of Hibiki each day. They go on the shelves right at 7:30 a.m., and they're all gone within 10 minutes. Next time around, I'll talk with Dave Broom. His latest book, The Way of Whiskey, looks at the entire culture around Japanese whiskeys. With all of the attention on Speyside this week and the Spirit of Speyside Festival, we're getting some details on some new whiskeys out of Speyside. The Balvenie is releasing its second annual batch of 14-year-old Peat Week. The batch was distilled during 2003 in the 1 week a year when they distill peated malt at the Balvenie. It'll only be available at first in the UK, Europe, Russia, and Taiwan for £60. That's around $82 a bottle. Meanwhile, our friends at ScotchWhisky.com reported on Saturday that the Glenlivet's Alan Winchester unveiled the new Captain's Reserve edition during his festival tasting. It's been finished in ex-cognac casks and right now is only available at the distillery for £50 a bottle. That's about $68 US. It'll be available starting later this month in global travel retail and later this year in key domestic markets. And with the royal wedding coming up later this month, the English Whiskey Company is releasing a special bottling from its Royal range. The bottle features a hand-engraved portrait of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. The whiskey itself is blended from a variety of the distillery's casks. 588 bottles will be available for around £80 each, $108, through the distillery's website. Now, if you're visiting Scotland and you're driving up from England, you'll pass through the Borders region as you enter southeastern Scotland. It's been a long, long time since there's been a whiskey distillery in the Borders, which, of course, is part of Scotch Whisky's Lowlands region. In fact, until the Borders Distillery in Hawick started laying down spirit a few weeks ago, there had not been a distillery in the Borders since 1837. The distillery opened for tours this week for the first time. Tim Carton and his three partners had worked together at William Grant & Sons in the past. They spent several years raising the money to build their distillery in one of Hawick's venerable industrial buildings.
It was a lovely old Victorian, what would have been an engineering works in one form or another. And prior to that was a bakery and there was a hosiery, and originally was the Hawick Electric Company. Because of the shape of it and the height of the halls and so on, it was idyllic for a distillery. And so we set about saying, well, we want to create something that is in our own likeness. We want something light, fruity. We don't want anything too heavy. And so we then put our heads together with a man called Stuart Nickerson, who's a veteran in the industry and has managed various different distilleries. And together with him and Forsyths of Rothes, we managed to put a plan together to fit this building and to deliver the sort of liquid we want.
Now, this is the first time there's been a Scotch whiskey distillery down in the Borders in almost 200 years, right?
That's correct. Yeah, we looked around and we'd taken the view that we wanted to bring distillation back to the Borders. As you say, the last time a distillery was registered as operating of this nature in the Borders was back in 1837. We've been to the records to be able to demonstrate that, and that was in Kelso. So the region had a great tradition of distillation many, many centuries ago. Some of it, of course, would have been illicit. But you may ask, well, what happened? And the reality is that the excise man came up on horseback across the border into Scotland and decided that he wanted his share of the action. And so most of the distilleries just scarpered into the Highlands and Islands, and some of them just couldn't survive for commercial reasons on the back of that. So for us, it's a story of revival. It's bringing back distillation to a region. It's also about regeneration of a beautiful old building and putting it back to good use. And the fact that Hawick, the town we're in, has got this tremendous tradition of industry, great sort of industrial heritage. It's the centre of cashmere and wool in Scotland. And coincidentally, that industry uses an enormous amount of water. So we knew that going to somewhere like Hawick was going to be come up trumps in terms of the sort of water we needed, and also knowing that barley was plentiful nearby in the Borders. There was also a good tick in the box as well. But it's got a great sort of work heritage, great workforce, and so we're delighted to be doing it.
It'll be 3 years at least before the first Borders single malt is mature. In the meantime, they have launched a pair of Clan Fraser blended Scotch whiskies, along with the Lower East Side blended malt. You'll find a link for more details in our show notes at whiskycast.com, and that's also where you can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long. The news is brought to you by Highland Park, the Orkney single malt with Viking soul. If you're a Highland Park lover, you should be part of Highland Park's Inner Circle. It's free to join, and you'll get access to exclusive bottlings, inside news from the gang on Orkney, and now there's an even better benefit. Ever wanted to own your own cask of Highland Park, but didn't want to have to wait 12 years for it to mature? Now you don't have to. Highland Park's Viking Soul Cask program is only available to members of the Inner Circle, and only until the end of this month. Join the Inner Circle and get the details at highlandparkwhiskey.com. Time now for the WhiskeyCast calendar of events. The Whiskey Sisters will lead a tasting of John Milroy selection whiskeys at the Union League in Philadelphia, May 17th. Whiskey Live Pretoria runs from the 17th through the 19th in South Africa. The Oxford Bourbon Festival and Auction is the 18th through the 20th in Oxford, Mississippi. And the Lakes Distillery will have its Spring Whiskey Festival in Setmurthy, England on the 19th and 20th. The Campbellton Malts Festival is May 23rd through the 25th in Campbellton, Scotland. And Fégil, the Isla Festival of Malt and Music, takes over the island from May 25th through June 2nd. Now, that first weekend of the Isla Festival is also Memorial Day weekend in the U.S., and M.B. Rowland Distillery in Pembroke, Kentucky, will kick off its summer Pickin' on the Porch concert series May 26th. And finally, Whiskey Live Louisville is coming up June 2nd. Right now, we have 237 different events on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com, and we're always adding new events. If you have a festival, tasting, or other whiskey-related event coming up, just use the contact form on our website to let us know about it.
This is whiskey. Johnny Walker's Scotch Whisky. From this place, and these places in that place. These are the people that make it. This is what they sound like.
Because you're a cheeky wee blighter.
Dance like. Aye, like that. This is what they do all day. Building the great character of Johnny Walker Black Label. Aging in oak for 12 long years.
Thanks. Oh, it's gorgeous there.
What is character? It's giving a damn.
You're all right, lassie.
Which looks like this, as much as this. See, the land that shapes these people and the people that shape this whiskey all shape how bloody good it tastes.
Put the bloody game on the telly, Alan.
A whiskey as bold as it is complex. For every step you take, this is Johnny Walker Black Label, friends. Step right up.
Cut.
Can I drink this now?
Johnny Walker Black Label Blended Scotch Whisky, 40% alcohol by volume, imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Coming up later on our new Behind the Label feature, whiskey makers have known for generations that maturing whiskey makes it taste better. But when did governments start requiring a minimum maturation period?
If you look at the overall evolution, you find that it was up to the individual distiller as to how long they actually aged their whiskies.
Longtime distiller and whiskey historian Barry Crockett will give us the rest of the story later on Behind the Label. Right now, it's time for WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Lagavulin. Bob Dylan is the last celebrity you'd think of to lend his name to a product endorsement. In fact, you'll probably never, ever hear one of his songs used in an ad. So, when word broke the other day that Bob Dylan was putting his name on a whiskey brand, both music and whiskey lovers took it seriously. Dylan has teamed up with Marc Bushala's Chicago-based Spirits Investment Partnership to create the Heaven's Door whiskey brand. Of course, the name comes from one of Dylan's most popular songs. Now, Bob Dylan rarely does interviews, and this is certainly no exception. But I spent some time on the phone late this week with Marc Bushala and his Director of Whiskey Development, Ryan Perry. As you might guess, they've been fielding a lot of calls since the news broke about Heaven's Door.
We're really excited by the response and the fact that we want to continue to expand the catalog and work with other parties opens up tons of doors for some really interesting product. And I think that's one of the most exciting elements of the brand. We've received hundreds of emails from all over the country from people that are excited and would be interested in working with us. And that's going to be, for Ryan, myself, and for the Dylan camp, seeing what's unique out there, getting our hands on some great product that has a different taste profile and creating new expressions. I think that's what's most exciting. This is not a one-trick pony. It's going to be constant evolution, and I think that's half the fun.
Are you surprised by the reaction to this week? Because this has gotten more reaction than Matthew McConaughey did with Wild Turkey,
Then, for instance, this whole deal we've been talking about the last couple of months with Metallica working with Dave Pickerel on something. This seems to have really sort of taken off with a lot of people.
We're thrilled. We're not surprised. I think the fact that a couple of things. Dylan's never done anything like this before, and probably the last person you'd expect that would have a commercial brand. But then again, Dylan always tends to do the unexpected. I think that's part of the interest. The fact that it's not a license deal, it's a partnership, and he's very involved, is interesting to a lot of people. And, it's definitely interesting to consumers because this has been covered, all over the globe. So we're thrilled by it. We did anticipate that there would be hardcore Dylan fans that, might be cynical about it. But the fact is the whiskey, even before we launched, we entered into numerous competitions blindly and did extremely well. In San Francisco, we received double gold. The Ultimate Spirit Challenge, we got 96-point rating. The liquid's phenomenal. And that was always our focus with the brand. It's like, we're not trying to be mass market. We want to produce something that's really good. And I think we've achieved that. So anyone who would be cynical, any whiskey drinker, I think, would drink it and say, this is legitimate. It's a great product.
I know that you had been looking and doing some other opportunities after the Angel's Envy deal a couple of years ago, but how did this one work out?
We set out after Angel's Envy to take some of our relationships and knowledge and some of the talents in our team and look at doing other spirit deals, both investing in some brands that were already in market or development, as well as creating our own. And we happened to have seen an announcement that Dylan had registered a trademark application for bootleg whiskey, which really intrigued us. We thought it was most intriguing because, one, Bob has never done a commercial deal before, and two, because he really has what we consider a lot of attributes that I think resonate with whiskey drinkers. But it was also one that we thought would be fraught with potential pitfalls if it wasn't done well, and had some thoughts as to how we would want to approach it if we were involved with the brand. So we started talking a lot internally and just riffing on ideas, and eventually started hounding Bob's manager and got on the phone with him, explained some of our ideas. He connected us with Bob, and Bob really loved what we had to say, and that the whiskey had to be the hero of the brand. And whiskey drinkers are a little bit cynical and would, if the whiskey didn't stand up on its own, it would be a problem. That there's too many celebrity deals out there where the product is not necessarily up to snuff. So he had a very much a whiskey-centric focus and liked that we did as well. In fact, one of our earliest recommendations was there be really no reference to Dylan at all with the product. Later it came to light that using his artwork would work extremely well for the brand. But again, very few people even know that Dylan does metal ironwork sculptures or painting. So nothing about the product screamed Dylan, just the name Heaven's Door, which came later, but kind of a nod and a wink to Dylan fans.
The obvious joke would be that if you bugged his manager, you're either going to get a contract or a restraining order at some point.
Well, maybe bugged is not the right word. I wouldn't call it stalking, but we were, we lobbed a few calls in, and I think he was actively looking at ideas as to how he would take this desire of Bob's to get in the whiskey business and make it a reality. So he was certainly receptive to a conversation. And I'm sure that we weren't the only one, but I think we approached it from a different angle. Certainly what our vision for what would become Heaven's Door resonated with Bob. And once we met and kind of laid out how we would approach the brand, they were eager to get started working together right away.
How did you actually put this brand together with the whiskeys? Because we know you don't have a distillery yet. That's coming in Nashville. But how did you put the whiskeys together?
Well, just about any whiskey brand that wants to launch, you're either starting with sourced inventory, or you're going to start laying down product with a plan of commercializing it in 3, 4, 5 years. We were fortunate in that we had been building up a pretty significant library of very good aged spirits, not knowing yet what brands we wanted to use it for, but knowing that if you want to get into the branded whiskey space, you got to start with some good product. So we had a pretty good amount of inventory that we really loved. it was interesting because part of our idea for Heaven's Door would be that it's going to be an evolving collection of different whiskey expressions. So you didn't need necessarily, 10 or 15 year supply of a single liquid. That once our initial inventory of our 3 expressions is gone, expression 4, 5, 6 will most likely be something very different.
You started off with a straight Tennessee bourbon, which I think is going to confuse a lot of folks because we know that Tennessee makes bourbon and Tennessee whiskey is essentially bourbon, but this is going to throw some folks off.
And just because it's a bourbon from Tennessee and people are expecting only whiskey from Tennessee?
Well, just because they're not used to seeing a straight Tennessee bourbon.
Yeah.
Because I don't think anybody's released anything labeled as a straight Tennessee bourbon for a long time.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things we like is, not having a commodity type product out in the market, and it's a unique, to Tennessee and bourbon, and so we're really excited about that.
Can you tell us where the whiskeys came from? That's the question everybody's been asking me.
We can tell you that it came from Tennessee, but as part of our transaction and acquiring the inventory, we signed some, strict confidentiality. We wouldn't release the distiller, but we think the people that care can, do what they need to at least try to find or narrow down the sources.
Well, let's be realistic here. There aren't that many distilleries in Tennessee that are making enough aged whiskey in quantities enough that they could sell to someone other than use for their own purposes. So the pool of usual suspects draws down to maybe 2 or 3 at best, I would think. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. We would agree with you.
Okay. The straight rye, though, is that also a Tennessee rye?
No, that is from Indiana.
So we know where that one came from. But putting it into cigar barrels is something I haven't seen tried before. Where'd the idea for that come from?
Well, that's an interesting story. We were doing a tour of some wineries out in Napa. And one of the wineries was putting basically each year's vintage into just about every kind of different barrel they could get to see what the effects were on the finished product. Because as you know, the barrel has a huge influence on the liquid. And in the corner, there was, maybe 4, 5, 6 different barrels that were very unusual in shape. So I inquired about that. These were from Bordeaux. They're called Cigar Barrels. They stand significantly taller. They're more narrow, squeezed down in the middle. How many gallons in a cigar barrel?
They're 210 liters, so like 55 gallons.
Yeah. I don't know if you could hear that, but about 210 liter barrels.
Okay.
So we found a producer of these cigar barrels. They're about 5 times the cost of a regular barrel. And we had them shipped to us, and we put liquid in them, had it sit for 6 or 8 months to see what kind of influence it had on the rye. And you couldn't tell that it was the same product after 6 months in the cigar barrels. It had a significant influence on the taste, which we really loved. We also loved the fact that it hadn't been done before. And then we played a little bit with a little bit of blending as well to change the flavor profile of the rye that we had purchased. The combination of the blending and the barrel finishing really yielded a unique flavor profile.
Yeah, and I think specific to our cigar barrels, because cigar is a reference to the shape, so there's different types of cigar barrels. We wanted air-dried barrels from that region just because of the open-air seasoning that occurs versus a kiln-drying. Bourbon barrel is significantly different, so we've benefited from having the patience, and, part of the reason they are so expensive is because the wood sits open and has the natural seasoning from the seasonality of that part of the region of France. So that made a great and favorable impact on the rye whiskey. That wood's more porous than a traditional American oak is. So that combined with the 2-year air dried, they're not charred barrels, and we did that purposely as well, just because we think some of the red layer from the char takes away from the hand toasting of the barrels of the French oak. So we got very technical and had a lot of trial and error before we ended up with the specific barrel spec that we had for the cigar barrels we use on the rye.
Let's talk about the distillery now, because you are planning one for next year in Nashville. Why Nashville?
Why Nashville? Well, certainly the fact that it is the Music City had some influence on our thinking. Dylan's relationship with Nashville, where he's recorded 4 albums, including Nashville Skyline, and the influence that he left on that city. And the fact that we've got Tennessee whiskey is a key factor. And it's one of the most interesting cities in America. I don't know the last time you may have been there, but it's really happening. There were probably just a handful of cities that we really liked for the distillery. This seemed like the obvious choice. And we happened upon a 140-year-old church that was available, one in the market. We immediately made an offer. It had been housing architects for the last 20 years who owned the building. So we purchased it from the architects. They are now our architects of record for the distillery and brand center. And we're pretty excited. It's going to have not only a distillery, but it's going to have the church itself is going to house the brand center, which will have a lot of Dylan's artwork. We'll also curate exhibits of other artists. We'll have a fair amount of video that we'll be doing there. We're building, hopefully, an art house cinema and live music hall. And we're going to have a restaurant with a significant whiskey bar as part of our project.
And let's talk about the Bootleg Series, which plays off that original name that he had tried to register for Bootleg Whiskey. But tell me about this series, because that's going to come out next year and be sort of unique whiskeys that come out of your inventory, right?
That's right. So we love the idea of bootleg whiskey. We liked Heaven's Door more as our core brand. But we thought using the Bootleg Series, playing off of Dylan's albums, as our limited release edition was a good use of that name. And it also gave us an opportunity to use his paintings as the inspiration for the package. So the Bootleg Series are going to be porcelain bottles with his paintings screened on them. They're really striking. There'll be box sets. We're looking at having his original hand-typed and handwritten lyrics included in each box. And the nice thing about the Bootleg Series is we've got these rare odd lots of inventory that certainly don't have the quantities that we want for a permanent edition, but for very limited releases, it's ideal. So right now we're planning our first Bootleg Series to come out end of next year, and it's a 25-year-old whiskey, and we'll be doing a unique barrel finish too.
And then the long-term plan is to use your Tennessee whiskey that you'll be distilling in Nashville as the basis for this brand, right?
It'll only be a portion of what we do. The distillery is going to be a relatively small distillery in terms of production. So I would assume that somewhere around maybe 10 to 20% of our total production. But we'll be using it for some limited releases. We probably will be doing it for using some of our products for blending. We're really interested in part of the key idea behind the whole project was collaboration with other distillers and blenders. So we're hoping to continue to build those relationships with people that have distilleries that have some really great product that we will partner with to create unique releases for Heaven's Door.
Who are you working with on the distillers front? Who would we know?
We haven't made any definitive decisions from a operations or distilling standpoint that would be any name that you recognize. So until then, it's a to be determined. We're definitely talking to local people as well as some names in the whiskey industry. So we can't say that for certain yet. Yeah, other than Mark just mentioned, Jordan. So Jordan Vai of Breckenridge. I have had a previous relationship with him in the industry for over 5 years. So he was our first major collaborator and has been, alongside of me in creating the first 3 expressions for Heaven's Door. So he'll continue to be a part of the team, as a partner of Heaven's Door. But in addition to him, we plan to, as Mark mentioned, work with other distilleries and distillers that are, in the American whiskey business.
How much influence does Dylan have in actually creating these whiskeys? How involved was he in the blending process and actually coming up with the entire brand proposition as well as the artwork? Obviously, the bottles are featuring some of his ironworks and some of his projects that he's done in the past, but how much creative input did he have into the whiskey?
Everything that we were trying in our whiskey profiles, Bob was involved in tasting and providing feedback. So we would start with some ideas as to what we would like to do, create several different iterations of taste profiles, sample them with Bob, take his feedback, go back, make tweaks. So he has, kind of ultimate say on the final product. He's not in the basement mixing up the medicine. He's given us more creative direction and ultimately telling us when we've gotten to something that he really loves. So it was a very interesting process because his feedback is not what you get in terms of technical feedback from somebody who's a whiskey, blender or distiller, but someone with a very sophisticated palate and very specific notions as to what he wanted to have in terms of taste. Some of it was direct, some of it required a little bit of interpretation on our side, but it always ended up yielding some pretty exciting results.
Give me an example of his tasting notes and his feedback. What did he tell you that you had to interpret?
Well, there was one. We arrived at a flavor profile we loved for what ultimately became our double barrel whiskey, and he liked the taste, but he said something was just missing. We were asking what he thought was missing from it, and he said it should be like being in a wood structure. And we were just there's this long pause, and we kind of just looked like we knew what he was talking about, but went away and think, what does that mean, being in a wood structure? And, we didn't know if that was a doghouse or a rail car or a church or a barn or a rick house, but we started thinking about how to give the whiskey more of, wood qualities and notes. So that led to the double barrel finish and playing with different chars and different barrels. And one yielded a really interesting nose and some nice flavor notes. And that's what we ended up ultimately using for our double barrel finish.
How are his nosing skills?
I would say good. He's got a good palate. He's got a good nose. Again, it's much more like, does he like it? And, Bob was always after more of a mood or a feeling with the whiskey, and that's where there was a lot of interpretation. So it made for interesting tasting notes.
Mark, you got started in this a few years ago working with the Hendersons and Lincoln Henderson on Angel's Envy, now Heaven's Door. Sounds like we got a theme going on here.
Yeah, that was an unfortunate coincidence. We looked at not a couple, we probably looked at a dozen names that we thought worked extremely well for Heaven's Door, taking inspiration from song lyrics, song titles, album names. And there was, a treasure trove of potential names that worked really well as a standalone for whiskey. Everyone thought that Heaven's Door was by far the strongest. And the fact that we're using gates as imagery, although I think most people looking at the bottle wouldn't be able to tell you those were gates, but that's what they are. We loved that kind of play. So, Heaven's Door, it became just a coincidence with Angel's Envy. I would really be hard-pressed to come up with a new brand that had anything to do with heaven or angels.
Devil's Cut, but that's already been taken by Jim Beam. But
Already done.
Thanks to Marc Bushala and Ryan Perry of Heaven's Door for joining us on WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Lagavulin, the legendary Islay single malt. Look for the classic 16-year-old Lagavulin, along with the Distiller's Edition and the new 8-year-old Lagavulin at a whiskey shop near you. Find out more at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery.
As we heard, there are 3 different Heaven's Door whiskeys, and I was able to get samples of all 3 in time to taste them for this episode. Let's start off with the flagship Heaven's Door Tennessee Bourbon. It's bottled at 45% ABV, and once again comes from an undisclosed Tennessee distillery. I have some ideas, but without the facts to back up my hunch, we'll leave it at that. The nose has subtle spices with hints of allspice, ginger, and black pepper, along with vanilla, honey, and just a hint of pipe tobacco. The taste is thick and slightly dry at first, with spicy notes of black pepper and allspice that come on strong, but do not overpower the background notes of brown sugar, caramel, pipe tobacco, leather, and charred oak that create a nice balance and complexity. The finish is long, subtle, and slightly dry. Now, when I evaluate a whiskey, I put the thoughts of who made it or what celebrity put a name on it out of my mind and judge it on its own merits. This one is a winner. I'm scoring the Heaven's Door Tennessee Bourbon a 93. The cigar barrels that Ryan Perry mentioned they use for the Heaven's Door Straight Rye are unusual, and I'll admit that when I first read the news release the other day, I thought those barrels had been used to hold cigars, but as Ryan explained, the cigar name refers to the shape of the barrel. Now, you've probably tasted at least one MGP rye whiskey from Indiana over the years, probably more than one, and this is unusual. Those cigar casks did something really different to the Heaven's Door Straight Rye whiskey. It's bottled at 46% ABV. The nose has notes of linseed oil, lemon furniture polish, ginger, nutmeg, and a slightly herbal aroma. The taste is spicy, though, with clove, black pepper, and chili powder notes that stick to the tip of your tongue and hold on tight. There's a subtle lemony tartness underneath, along with ginger, honey, and vanilla. The spices last a long time on the finish before fading away gently with hints of sweetness. This may well be one of the best takes on an MGP rye whiskey yet. I'm scoring the Heaven's Door Straight Rye a 93. And you can find my tasting notes for the Heaven's Door Double Barrel on our website at whiskycast.com. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, makers of Bernheim Wheat Whiskey, the first new style of American whiskey to be introduced since Prohibition. Aged for 7 years in traditional open rickhouses, Bernheim's mellow taste is refreshingly smooth. Learn more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Diageo's Orphan Barrel label has released its 4th edition of Rhetoric Bourbon. This year's release is 24 years old and comes from the same batch of whiskey as the previous 3, with 1 more year in the barrel. It's bottled at 45.5% ABV, and you can smell it as soon as you open the bottle. Caramel, vanilla buttercream, pipe tobacco, a hint of apricot jam, and subtle spices fill the air. The taste is woody with great spices on top of baking chocolate and brown sugar, with hints of clove, coriander, and white pepper. Honey and vanilla, all things together in the background. The finish is long, dry, and sweet, with lingering hints of caramel, nutmeg, clove, and, of course, oak. It may be a bit woody for some people, but I'm scoring the 24-year-old release of Orphan Barrel Rhetoric a 92. And finally, let's look at the first release of the new Old Fitzgerald Bottled in Bond series, and we have to acknowledge that it does come from Heaven Hill. The spring 2018 edition is 11 years old and was distilled during the spring season of 2006. Of course, it's bottled at 50% ABV, and the nose has notes of caramel corn, charred oak, dark chocolate, honey, and a hint of molasses cookies. The taste starts off creamy and smooth with a burst of ground peppercorns that builds up slowly to a nice peak, while caramel, honey, vanilla, and a touch of oak provide a nice counterbalance. The finish is very long with spices that fade away gently, and sweeter notes of caramel, and chocolate fudge. I'm scoring the spring 2018 release of Old Fitzgerald Bottled in Bond Bourbon a 93. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, and I'm adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,100 different whiskeys from around the world. You'll find it at whiskeycast.com.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
Let's open up the inbox now for this week's Your Voice. It's brought to you by Lot 40. In our midweek episode, we heard from Deborah Stewart of Glenfarclas about their discovery of the oldest known intact bottle of Glenfarclas single malt that dates back to 1920 or so. Mike Simpson asked this question on Twitter. Just listened to yesterday's episode. Regarding the 1920 bottling of Glenfarclas, is there any record of how old the whiskey would have been at the time of bottling? Love being able to listen twice a week. Thank you, Mike. The entire interview with Deborah is available to listen to online at whiskycast.com. They're not really sure exactly how old the whiskey was when it was bottled, but the best guess is somewhere between 8 and 10 years old. A couple of weeks ago, I shared my tasting notes for the Two Brewers, batch number 9, a hopped Canadian single malt, and this weekend, someone at the Strath Liquor Store in Victoria, British Columbia, tweeted out, "Catching up on WhiskyCast this morning and glad to hear a review for Yukon Spirits Innovative Hopped Single Malt. Just to let you know, though, it's in BC too, hashtag not just Alberta and Yukon." And the Two Brewers folks chimed in a few minutes after that with, "and Quebec too." Well, I was going on what the note that came with that sample said, and as any Canadian whiskey lover knows, not all whiskeys are available in all provinces. But I'm glad to hear the folks in BC and Quebec are getting a chance to taste that one too. Finally, we gave away a signed copy of Dave Broom's book on Japanese whiskeys, The Way of Whiskey, a couple of weeks ago, and Omar Fitzel of Cork, Ireland, was our winner. The book arrived the other day, and Omar posted a photo of it on Twitter with thanks to us and to Dave, along with this comment. "I'm not sure what was better, winning the book or getting mentioned on WhiskyCast." Thanks, Omar. Don't forget, we'll be talking Japanese whiskeys with Dave Broom next time around. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always post it on the Your Voice page at whiskycast.com or track us down on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast, and you can email us too. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. This week's Your Voice is brought to you by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Behind the Label is our new segment that digs into some of the stories that make whiskey unique, from the science and history to those little-known facts that might help you win a bar bet one of these days. We all know that most countries have a minimum age requirement for maturation before a spirit can legally be called whiskey. Usually it's at least 3 years. There are some exceptions, and we'll cover that in a minute. But what country was the first to establish a minimum in law? The United Kingdom first set its standard for Scotch and Irish whiskies with the Immature Spirits Act of 1915. According to Charles Maclean in his book, Maclean's Miscellany of Whiskey, and the following year raised it to a 3-year minimum. Remember, this was just before World War I, and all of Ireland was still under British rule at the time. Retired Irish distiller's master distiller Barry Crockett, who's also a whiskey historian, puts it into the context of the time.
There was no legal requirement to have an aging process as a legal requirement right up to really it was introduced during the course of the First World War, and it was then laid down as a war, I suppose. It was laid down as a measure to protect revenue for the United Kingdom and Ireland, of course, during the course of the First World War. Up to then, there was no legal requirement to actually have an age period where whiskey is concerned. And indeed, if you look at the overall evolution, you find that it was up to the individual distiller as to how long they actually aged their whiskies. It is interesting to note, however, that the records show that there was an increasing recognition that one needed to age whiskies to improve and enhance the quality of the whiskey in its own right. So while there wasn't a legal requirement, there was a recognition that aging was a desirable function, shall we say. After the introduction of maturation legislation, the requirements for a 5-year maturation. By law, you had to mature it for a period of time for 5 years, but that was then altered again back to the current 3 years, which is now part of EU regulations and requirements as well.
But was the British government the first to set a legal standard for maturing Scotch whisky? The answer? No. In Canadian Whisky, the portable expert, Davin de Kergamo writes that the Canadian government started requiring a single year's maturation all the way back in 1887 and doubled that to 2 years in 1890. But it took until 1974 for the current 3-year minimum to become part of Canadian law. The United States remains the major exception. Bourbons, ryes, and just about every other type of American-made whiskey have to be matured in oak, but technically, a distiller could put spirit into a barrel for a few minutes and legally be able to call it whiskey. Of course, since the law requires also that barrels be used only once for bourbons, ryes, malts, and wheat whiskeys, that idea is not terribly effective or cost-efficient. The only minimum aging requirement the U.S. imposes are 2 years of maturation for so-called straight whiskeys, and, of course, that any whiskey matured for less than 4 years carry an age statement. That's behind the label, and if you have a whiskey topic you'd like us to dig into on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com and get in touch with us. Of course, that's also where you'll find links for the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast and our WhiskyCast HD videos, the latest whiskey news, events, my tasting notes, and much more, including a complete archive of our past episodes. I hope you'll take a minute this week and leave a review or rating for WhiskyCast on your favorite podcast app. Those ratings do have an influence on search results that can help other whiskey lovers discover us when they're looking for podcasts. Our cask strength conversation goes on all week long online. You can join the fun by looking for us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast. And we're always available by email too. The address is comments@whiskycast.com.
This is whiskey, Johnny Walker's Scotch whisky, from this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnny Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2018, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Marc Bushala, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.